Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas.
And as folks know, we're doing a series on the 25th anniversary of the protests in Seattle around the World Trade Organization. And so this is another one of those shows. I'm gonna hand the intro today off to Bob.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be doing this. It's part of our series on the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Seattle WTO protest. Today, we're talking to somebody who I first met 25 years ago, not long before that. But I was already familiar with him. This is Kevin Danaher. Kevin is a very well-known activist and scholar, PhD in sociology from UC Santa Cruz, I believe, founder and executive director of Global Exchange, which is how I got to meet you at the time. And he's written a large number of books about this particular topic, anti-globalization, including 50 Years is Not Enough, which is about the World Bank and IMF. Corporations are going to get your mama, which I love that title. 10 Reasons to Abolish the IMF and World Bank. Globalize This. Insurrection, democratizing the global economy, building the global economy, and I'm sure I've left some out. Let me get started. I was familiar with your work already. I'd actually assigned it in class because I was teaching courses in things like globalization and capitalism and so forth. And then in the spring of 1999, a good friend of ours, mutual friend, Hap Ingham, invited you to Houston and asked me if I could host you and said something. I was like, oh, of course. That's when I first met you. I remember you said, I was picking you up at the airport. You said, look for a guy who looks like Jesse Ventura. And I said, you look for a guy who looks like Franco Harris. But at any rate, and I remember you came to my class and you spoke. We had a bigger event on campus with a great turnout. But the one thing that always sticks out, and I've told this story many times, is I remember you said, Buzz, we're going to shut down Seattle. We're going to shut down the WTO. Rolled my eyes. Yeah, sure. And you did it. But I want to before we talk about that, because I think among people who were active in that on that topic of anti-globalization and the IMF and the World Bank, you really were one of that first generation. I believe, like I said, I was familiar with you for a while already. What kind of got you interested in that? Why did you start focusing on these things that, other than I think a few kind of mostly lefty scholars, things like the IMF and the World Bank and NAFTA, the WTO, so forth? What got you interested in that? Why did you? What made you realize what a big and important thing this was, that these institutions, which were like controlling the global economy, they were anti-democratic and all that. What got you started on that? How did you go out there and evangelize this to people?
Yeah. Actually, it goes way back to when I was a kid. I was really lucky in that my father was an Irish immigrant. He came over in his 20s. He was born in 1902. He came over in the 1920s, and he raised me on these stories of what it was like growing up in southwestern Ireland, County Limerick, a little village called Arda. And his stories were about what it was like growing up under British military occupation. So things like he's out one day milking the cow. He was the oldest of 9 children. So his job was to milk the cow. And British troop truck comes along on the road, and they figure, hey, this will be fun. Let's shoot at this kid milking the cow. And they start shooting at him, and he dives behind some rocks, and they kill the family cow. So now there's 9 children and no milk. When you're a kid, it's just your dad telling you stories, and I love my dad. To this day, I think about him every day. He was just an amazing guy. Had a 3rd grade education. Both his sons got PhDs because he respected education because he had been deprived of it. He had to study his own language, Gaelic, Irish, in a church basement, hiding from the British authorities because they prohibited, you're going to learn the English language, the colonial, the oppressor's language. So when the war in Vietnam was going on and all this other U.S. imperialism going on, I related to my dad's story. I identified with the oppressed. I identified with the Vietnamese who were trying to fight against us. And when I got into graduate school at UC Santa Cruz, when it came time to write the first paper, I said, this International Monetary Fund and World Bank, it's interesting that there are these big, powerful organizations making these rules and moving all this money around, and nobody knows anything about them. I go around asking professors, hey, what is this International Monetary Fund? What is the World Bank? These are well-educated people, and you can do it to this day. I go around sometimes and I say to them, can you tell me about the World Trade Organization? Huh? What's that? They're writing a constitution for the entire planet that will impact everybody, every biological system, every crop. And nobody knows anything about them because they operate in secret, basically. So that was my beginning. And as I dug more into it, you drill down. I always used to read Sherlock Holmes to my daughters going to bed at night. Both of my daughters are also doctorates in law. They're both successful lawyers. And I like to think my reading Sherlock Holmes to them at night had something to do with that, because Sherlock Holmes never accepted superficial answers. He'd always want to dig down and find out, why did that dog not bark? Oh, because the perpetrator was the owner of the house. And that got me going into this whole corporate domination. Corporations are interested in maximizing their profits. If we went out to the majority of people on the planet and we said, look, there's two different ways we can organize the global economy. One is to have money values rule over the life cycle. The other would be to have life values rule over the money cycle. Should we subordinate people and nature to the economy, or should we subordinate the economy to people and nature? Most people would say, no, life values should dominate money values, but that's not what we've got. What we've got is money values, profit making, being the dominant force on the planet. And unfortunately, with the recent election results, we're going to get way more of the same. So that's unfortunate. But hey, we continue to struggle. La luta continua. Vittoria certa, as they say in Angola and Mozambique. Struggle continues.
Yeah, totally. With that, Seattle was in 1999. There's like decades of work that you and others did in building up to that. Why do you think that the movement caught on, let's say late 90s? That's when we started seeing a lot of anti-corporate globalization actions, mobilizations, protests happening around the world. But in the US, why do you think it's really caught on by like November 1990, after years of Clinton and strong economy, but also this neoliberal sort of model, which they championed?
Yeah, we were very lucky, actually, because just coincidentally, I was up in Seattle giving a talk at University of Washington when we found out that the WTO had picked Seattle as the location. They were going to do this, launch a new round of trade negotiations and pick a place in the United States. And the reason they picked Seattle was Microsoft and Boeing and some other corporations in that area wrote checks. Oh yeah, come here, do it here. And we were like, this is awesome. You've got the center of the direct action forest defender culture where people are willing to tie themselves to trees and go up and do tree sits like Julia Butterfly Hill. And we thought, this is great. So immediately what I started doing was going around to college campuses, because I had written some books already on this topic of the global economy and corporate domination. I started going around to college campus, and I would always open with this line of, how many people here were at Woodstock in 1969? And I put my hand up because I was lucky. I was there. It was awesome. It was transformative. I had my first LSD trip at Woodstock. It was amazing. And I go, oh, I'm the only one? Oh, but there's something even better coming up than that. And that's the WTO meeting in Seattle. And I would pump it like it was going to be this thing. And you're going to be able to do something for global justice. And what was really like edifying to me was at the event, there were young people that came up to me and said, you came to our campus and said this, we should come here. Just be great, man. I'm from Vermont or Montana, where the right it's spoken. And we eventually we put 50,000 people out on the street. And just through the massing of bodies, we blocked the delegates getting into the convention center. What I did was I dressed up in my best and I went to the convention center and I said, my trade association is thinking of renting this building. Could I have the floor plans so we know how to plan our event? So then when we did our training camps, we rented farms where we had hundreds of young people come together. How do you do a tree sit? How do you drop a banner off a building? How do you block a road? How do you block the entrance to a building? Non-violently, of course, nonviolent direct action. So we had guys dressed as bicycle messengers going around taking pictures of all 13 intersections around the convention center and all the doors, all the entrances, the places where police would possibly be, the hotels where the delegates would stay at. And we did these training camps planning for it. We had maps and we had teams of roughly 20, 21, 22 people. And this was, you had to create teams that were trained in direct nonviolence, that knew everybody on the team. We encouraged people, get stoned or drunk or take acid or whatever with your people so you really know who these are. Because in some of the training camps, we had a guy comes, we should get some guns and shoot the first MS in a limousine we see. And we're just like, whoa. And if you're not a cop plant, we're not into that. This is not about violence. It's about nonviolent direct action. So we had 9 months of planning and prepping and getting the word out and mobilizing people. And in the event, we had hog farmers from Oklahoma. We had Japanese Buddhist priests. We had all these different contingents. And afterwards, we criticized ourselves. In fact, some sections in Globalize This, the battle against the World Trade Organization and corporate rule, where we criticize ourselves for not being more diverse because we wanted more people of color. We wanted more oppressed communities. It's hard to fly Nigerian peasants to Seattle. There's a lack of money. If we had the kind of money that the WTO supporters had, we would have 100,000 people there, not 50,000 people. But a lot of planning, Public Citizen, the Direct Action Network, Art and Revolution. There were all these groups mobilizing for months and months to get enough people out there. And we purposely reached out to the trade unions. There was a big trade union conference that when they had their big meeting and they disbanded, they marched toward where we were already stationed. And Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO, did a symbolic sit down where he put a raincoat on the street because it had been raining and sat down as a symbolic gesture. It wasn't part of our sit down, but we're saying at the time to the thousands of union people, hey, come and join us. Come join us in this blockade. And we'll keep these delegates from getting into the conference. As it turned out, at Global Exchange, we're registered with the United Nations as a human rights organization. So my wife at the time, Medea Benjamin, Juliet Beck, and myself, we had passes to get into the opening ceremony. So we had gotten up really early in the morning. There were 2 major mobilizing sites, one down by Pike Market, down by the Bay, and one up by the junior college. And we're out there. It's really cold. The rain was coming in at an angle. The wind was strong. And this guy from Scotland gets up. He's got bare shoulders and wearing a kilt, exposed legs. And he jumps up on a dumpster and he starts yelling, "You think this is bad weather? This is not. Come on, people." And he gets the crowd riled up. And the drummers are drumming and we start marching up. And I look back and we've got quite a few thousand people in our group. And we get to a point where I can see up on the hill the group that's coming down from the junior college, and it's also massive. And it was at that moment that those of us that were in leadership positions realized, wow, we are people to shut this thing down. And we encircled the convention, the place, the theater where the opening ceremony was going to take place. And once we got everything in place, Global Exchange, our contingent was at one of the 13 intersections where we were lucky. We had a Teamsters truck, a big Teamsters truck that had a huge sound system. So we were playing dance music and people were making speeches from the different groups they represented. And Medea and Juliet and I, because we had passes, we got into the opening ceremony. And I had printed up, I designed the red crossout symbol. It had WTO with a crossout, and in the boundary it said end corporate rule. And I had these stickers that I was going to take inside the meeting hall and put these stickers all over. But you got to go through security. And I'm thinking, oh man, when security people see my WTO stickers and they'd looked at it, they passed it right through. For what it said on it. So I'm going around inside, sticking the men's robes, the pay phones, all these places, putting these WTO crossout stickers as a way to say, hey, we're inside your house, okay? We're not just outside, we're inside your house. And we see that there's only a couple hundred people that have managed to get through our blockade on the outside. And Medea sees that they're starting to pack up the translation equipment. She says, hey, look, they're going to shut this thing down. We got to get up on stage while the microphone's still hot and all the cameras are focused on that podium. So I figure we had a statement that we had prepared, a statement from the protest about the need for democracy and global negotiations. And I figure we're going to go up to the podium where all the microphones are in the middle of the stage. And as we get to it, Medea keeps walking over to the side of the stage in the wings. What are you doing? She goes over to Michael Moore, the head of the WTO. And she says, hey, when are you going to get this show on the road? Just a little extra slap in the face. And then she comes over, she introduces me, and I start reading this statement from the protest outside. And all of a sudden, there's a cop breaking my arm back here, and there's another cop breaking my arm back here. And I'm thinking, no, I'm a redwood tree. I'm rooted in the crowd. I'm going to keep reading this. They start dragging us out. And funniest thing, we're yelling, freedom of speech, First Amendment rights, blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. And as they're dragging us out, there's two cops holding Medea in front, and there's two cops holding me. And they had those big metal archway metal detectors set up. And Medea, as is her wont, she's only 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, but you don't want her enemy. She sticks her feet out, hooks this metal archway, and tips it over so that it collapses and wires are popping out and sparks are flying. And I'm cracking up laughing because I live with that. I deal with that on a daily basis. So I'm laughing. One of the cops says, what's so funny? I said, that's my wife, man. I got to live with that. You only got to deal with her for a few minutes. And one cop laughed and it's not funny. So they arrested her. They threw me out and they threw Juliet out, but they arrested her. So I run back to where our group was. I get up on the microphone and I'm announcing what happened inside. And I say, yeah, and they arrested Medea. And I look and I see Medea coming through the crowd. And I said, what happened? She gets up on the microphone. She says, here's what you do. They arrest you. You start screaming, I got to pee. I got to go to the bathroom. To find a lady cop, they have to take her to the bathroom. They bring her back a little while. I'm having my period. I don't have bags. They let the woman, they deal with it. Finally, she was so much of a pain in the ass, they just threw her out. She comes back to the demonstration. And what we saw was a very interesting thing on the barricades where a lot of people were there. We were like 5-10 people thick. It was just solid. And the delegates are trying to get through. And very interesting conversations happened between the delegates and the protesters. And the delegates were realizing these protesters aren't a bunch of stupid kids. They've actually done some research. They know about the environmental effects. They know about the impacts on labor unions, the dolphins, and all this other stuff, because we had been doing our research and getting the information out there. So it was really good to see. And there were some of the delegates that tried to force their way through, and we just locked arms. And then the police came, and the police started doing their violence. And I had been in protests before, and I knew what tear gas was. I've been tear gassed. I've been roughed up. Having played football all my young life really helped for that. But it was really brutal. There was a guy next to me got hit in the face with a rubber bullet and just opened up his face. You could see the roots of his teeth. We had to take him to the emergency room. He ended up getting a lot of money actually from that. And that happened with other people. They were doing stuff like shooting pepper spray right in your face at point blank range and then rubbing your eyes so that it would be worse. But we had medical teams that were coming in, washing people's eyes out. And as one group got hammered by the police, they would back up. Another group would come in, replace them, and we just kept the line going. Later that night of the first night, they did arrest quite a few people. We were doing observation delegations to go to the jail and make sure we were outside chanting and keeping the people on the inside of the jail knowing that we were still out there in solidarity with them. But the cops went nuts in one of the main neighborhoods where people who had not been radicalized about the WTO saw the police brutalizing people and shooting tear gas in a neighborhood that was just a residential neighborhood. And people started doing things like putting urine in a balloon, like a water balloon, and throwing it off their balcony onto the police. And there became like this citizen resistance. And one of the unfortunate things that happened was there was a contingent of people that called themselves anarchists, although whether they ever read anarchism theory or not, I don't know. And they did some breaking of windows. And we were trying to say, look, you're breaking a window. You might hurt the workers inside with the broken glass. Some of us were, me and Mike Dolan and others were standing in front of windows to protect them from getting broken. And what happened from that was the corporate media focused on the window breaking, not on our critique. I gave an interview to a guy from the New York Times where I talked to him for about 30 minutes explaining the details of the WTO, why it was bad. And he used this one stupid little quote where I said, oh, convincing the WTO of these critiques would be like convincing Cuba of capitalism, or some stupid little throwaway statement. So it was really unfortunate because 60 Minutes had worked with us ahead of time, and they were planning to have our activists featured in a critique section where our critique of the WTO would be presented. Once the Black Bloc broke the windows, they just focused on the violence of the protesters, when really all the violence was from the police. And in fact, the chief of police had to resign, the mayor had to resign in the aftermath of the event. Bands did roll, but not in our movement.
It's really hard to follow up on that story, but I'll try. I want to just one last time go back to the period leading up to that, because this is something that I have to say, I should have said this in the intro. You were really important, actually. Like, I'd been involved in politics from a young age, but in the 90s, I'd just been to Houston as a professor. I was doing some radio. And when I started dealing with this issue, and especially after meeting you, I became really very active. I was speaking every week. I was telling Scott the other day, like every week at least, maybe sometimes twice, I would speak at groups or churches, or I got involved with the AFL-CIO and so forth, which is a segue into what I was going to ask. You mentioned that this is a protest that involved farmers and priests and students, and of course, labor and the environmentalists. Leading up to it, this, like you said, this is not an issue a lot of people knew about. I knew about it because I'd been reading my field is foreign relations. So I read a ton of stuff about the Cold War, and there were especially new left historians who focused on things like Bretton Woods and whatever. How do you approach these people to convince them that this big supranational institution, which they probably haven't heard about, is bad for us? How did you teach them about that? How'd you educate them? What kind of things did you bring up? There's so many different elements to it, right?
Yeah. Most people have a sense of, we've been told we're a democratic country, democracy. So people understand, okay, if you want democracy, you have to have transparency. The fact that members of Congress can invest in stocks that then they pass laws benefiting those companies that they own stocks in. Most Americans, when you tell them that, they go, that shouldn't be legal. So transparency, if you go back to the founding of the World Bank and the IMF, which are the predecessors of the WTO, WTO only came about in the 90s, they had their original meeting up in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And you say, why Bretton Woods, New Hampshire? Because Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, was Jewish. And the only resort that they could find that would allow Jews to be there, this is the 1940s, was Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. So they get together. And what their problem was, during World War II, the capitalists, the businesses of Western Europe, had either sided with the Nazis, had their banks and factories blown up by the fighting, or they fled. So here you have, at the end of World War II, you have Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. Western Europe, the business class is decimated, or they are delegitimated for siding with the Nazis. And who is strong is the left. It's socialists, communists, anarchists. And they've got guns because they led the resistance against the Nazis. So for the U.S. empire, this is really a terrible situation. You've got to get the business classes back in power in Western Europe. So even before the war is over, they're doing Bretton Woods, figuring out the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Marshall Fund, after George Marshall. The Marshall Fund was propagandized as rebuilding Europe. It wasn't about rebuilding Europe. It was about rebuilding the political power of the business classes who had been decimated and delegitimated during the war, and suppress the left, which had gained all this credibility and had guns. Lucky Luciano, convicted mafia don, was in state prison in New York State. He was released on the condition that he go back to Italy and revive the mafia, especially in the docks, because Mussolini had crushed the unions, and now the communists were rebuilding the unions on the docks. And if you're going to do free trade and corporate profit making, you don't want communist trade unions in the docks. You want to crush them. And Lucky Luciano was released from prison to go help rebuild opposition to the communists using mafia tactics, which they did. So this is a history that the American people don't understand. And this is the roots, the deep roots of the World Trade Organization and this corporate dominated global constitution. How do we make rules that are going to favor profitability for big transnational corporations?
Right. And then the other force that was also involved in that post-war period is American labor. As American labor worked with the U.S. government, there's a lot of documentation on this, a lot of literature on this about how the AFL-CIO actually worked with the CIA to stop communists from being elected in Italy and Greece, France.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of anti-apartheid work because my doctoral dissertation was on U.S. policy towards South Africa. And the AFL-CIO gave the George Meany Award to Gotcha Buthelezi, who was a Black collaborator with the white regime. He was one of the rulers of a Bantustan. I was going to South Africa on a regular basis, doing interviews and research. And people were like, he's a collaborator, he's a scumbag, he's getting paid off. And I made the mistake of saying at an AFL-CIO meeting, Gachiboudi's collaborator, right when they had just given this order. So I was persona non grata for a while, leadership. But to show you how far things changed over the course of those protests, after the WTO protests, we put together a huge coalition of groups that was going to protest the fall meetings of the World Bank IMF in 2001 in Washington, D.C. And the AFL-CIO, in fact, when we had the big meeting, it was this massive conference room at National Geographic. I gave up my seat to George Meany so he could sit down and participate in this meeting. And we had anarchists and women's groups and church groups and all these different groups. The AFL-CIO leadership had agreed to collaborate with us on a sit down in the streets to block access to the IMF World Bank meetings. And we were just so elated by that. We were like, oh, this is awesome, with the AFL-CIO on our side. And then September 11th, 2001, boom. And the AFL-CIO says, no, we can't do a protest like that because of the effects of this. When you look at their lifestyle, when I was writing about the World Bank and the IMF, I came across this incident where the biggest amount of protest letters to the World Bank newsletter was they were considering a policy of not traveling first class when they travel internationally to save money. When the World Bank economists protested, this is terrible, you're threatening my livelihood and my life, I need to travel first class. I was in debates with these people on radio stations where I would say, my salary at Global Exchange is $18,000 a year. What's your salary at the IMF? Or what's your salary at the WTO? They wouldn't say what their salary was. Well, you got to keep your salary secret. I grew up in a working class family. Everybody knew each other's salary. But that was either a point of pride or a point of, oh, woe is me, I wish I made more money. So these organizations operate in secret. Nobody knows anything about them. So what we were trying to do at Seattle was bring the snake out from under the rock and say, is this a poisonous snake or non-poisonous snake? We need to know. Transparency is essential for true democracy.
On that stuff, I have a question of my day job is I'm at Rainforest Action Network. And so we talk a lot about the inside-outside strategy, right? And as you're like, you went inside the meeting when the blockades were happening outside. And it sounds like you also engaged with officials within some of these big transnational trade organizations, but especially after Seattle, what was their fear level? How scared were they after this sort of movement erupted and shut down their meeting? And then these movement campaigns began. Like, how did you gauge how effective you were being? How worried were they? That sort of thing.
You could see it immediately when Bill Clinton came to Seattle. He right away made this speech about labor rights. Oh, we're going to promote labor rights. This is the guy who pushed through NAFTA and all this other stuff about, free trade was going to make a rising tide floats all boats. A rising tide for people without boats, or boats, little crappy boats, like the boats that the refugees are drowning in crossing the Mediterranean or the English Channel. Yeah, rising tide sinks them. So the ideology that they put forward was that, hey, this corporate dominated thing, it's going to be good for everybody. And in fact, just look at the record. There's worse poverty now. There's worse inequality in the world. Every biological system is in a state of collapse. As you know well, Rainforest Action Network. By the way, a little footnote about to divert here, but Randy Hayes and I were arrested once. Randy Hayes, one of the founders of Rainforest Action Network.
We've had him on the show before.
We were chained to the door of a corporation that was messing with dock workers unions in San Francisco. And we got arrested and we get put in jail. And somehow we found out that we were born on this same year. We were like, what? And here we are in jail together. How appropriate.
The founders of RAND and Global Exchange at that too.
Yeah, we had chained ourselves to the door and the cops were like, hey, come on. I always used to get a Santa outfit so that at Christmas time, I would chain myself to the doors of Nike or whatever sweatshop protest was going on. And the cops would always be, oh, dude, look, the cameras are here. We don't want to put you this. Look, could you please unlock yourself from the tactics of direct nonviolent action are never going to go away. It's all about getting enough people out in the street. And we're going to see this now in the Trump era. It's going to be really necessary to educate and mobilize, get people out there actually doing stuff and not going for this disempowering. I'd go out and I'd always do these talks with analysis and then, come on, let's change this. There's suffering in the world that we can have a positive impact on fixing it. And people would come up to me and invariably somebody would say, but I'm only one person. What can I do? Unless you have a multiple personality disorder or you're Siamese twins, everybody's only one person. But that statement by people is a statement of powerlessness. And I think our major enemy is the cult of powerlessness. People finding excuses. I have some religious friends that will do, oh, God will fix it. Jesus will come and fix it. I don't have to do anything. If we just wait long enough, some grand God of the universe is going to come. It's a cop-out. It's people saying, I don't feel empowered enough to do something about it. And that's why I find a lot of hope in younger generation. I see a lot of young people, especially in the climate change movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, the nonviolence movement, saying, look, we got to take control. It's time for a new generation. We now have the oldest president-elect ever. He's going to be in his 80s running the White House, supposedly running the White House. There'll be other people running it. He'll be just the front man. And I think there's an opportunity here for the youth to step forward and say, let's change the rules of the game.
Let me ask you about the kind of immediate aftermath of Event 30, because we saw that in Houston. That's when Scott and I met. We actually formed a very impressive group committed to that. And like a lot of people, 911 kind of monkey wrenched all that. But between N30, 99 and 911, we saw a great deal of momentum. Seattle meant a lot to a lot of people. I was able to go out there and do debates and talking to people, and Scott was organizing in the streets. What did that give you a sense of hope? What did you think was possible after that? Because even I know you would, like I said, you told me, oh, we're going to shut it down. Like, rolled my eyes, but I would assume that success probably took you even a little bit by surprise. What did you see happening until everything else came in and caved on it?
The immediate effect in San Francisco, I lived in San Francisco for 30 years. I only recently moved up here to the mountains. We had protests going on, anti-sweatshop protests going on. And I remember people had the headline from the Seattle newspaper, WTO talks collapse. And we were out there going, see, we can do this, we can do this. And it really helped mobilize people. That following spring, there were World Bank IMF meetings in Washington, D.C., where they traditionally meet. And we got out there really early in the morning and started blocking roads. And funny thing happened. This one intersection where the Global Exchange contingent was blocking the road, this bus comes and everybody figures it's delegates to the World Bank IMF meetings. And we jump up, climb on the bus. Medea throws herself on the windshield of the bus like a fly. onto the windshields, right? And we stop this bus, and I get up on the windshield and I look in the bus, and I said, these don't look like delegates. They look like tourists. And I said to the bus driver, show us some ID. They were tourists from Minnesota. I'm yelling to me, okay, climb down. They're not delegates to the meeting. And then later, boy, that gives those tourists a great story. How they survived the protesters. What happened since then is you'll notice that they get when they're having these big corporate elite meetings, they get the police out there early. They get the security out there really early. They make sure the delegates get in ahead of demonstrations, and or they have their meetings in very remote places or in Abu Dhabi or places that are totally undemocratic where they could just arrest people if they protest. So we see this de-democratization going on. Corporate domination undermines democracy. You can't have democracy and global corporate imperialism at the same time. And we see it here. And I got to give Trump credit. The one thing that he stumbled into was the less educated white working class males who used to be able to get good paying factory jobs. Those factories are gone. Those factories went to Mexico, Brazil, China. His Bible was printed in China. Most of his products and his daughter's products were made in China. But they tapped into this thing of, you've been screwed. They didn't say by capitalism. They say the elites, the liberal elites, the media elites, the Hollywood elites, whatever, without much detailed analysis. And we're going to fix this. Now, of course, they're not going to fix that. But that resonated with the less educated white working class that, hey, we're getting screwed. You're doing all these programs for Black people and immigrants, but we got screwed. And you saw all these towns in the Rust Belt where the battery factory moved to Mexico or the car factory moved to China or whatever. And the thing is, China's leaders were schooled in Marxist theory. They understand capitalism way better than most Americans do, but they don't treat it ideologically as the free market that's going to solve all of our problems. They understand it as a system that has a certain kind of DNA, that it's all about money. And if you can export products into the U.S. market at below competitive prices from U.S. factories, you're going to gain those markets. Look at the solar industry, wind energy industry, battery industry. But they figured out how capitalism works and what the DNA of capitalism is, and they're working it. And the response from the idiots over here is, well, just put tariffs. I don't think Trump even understands what a tariff is. That tax is going to get passed on to American consumers. In the consumer society, what was the big issue? Oh, the cost of groceries. Without an analysis of the monopolization of those sectors, look at a typical family farm. Here's a family farm, a small business operation. Upstream, where they get their chemicals and machinery and fertilizer, it's highly monopolized. 3, 4, 5 companies dominate the market. On the downstream end, where they're selling their products, it's also highly monopolized. A handful of large corporations. And here's the family farm caught in the middle. And what do the statistics show? The family farm is being killed. It's being murdered. The average age of an American farmer keeps going up into 60s. So in response, you get young people realizing, hey, we're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have to come together, create intentional communities, do permaculture, grow crops ourselves, feed ourselves, take control. If you look at the transnational corporation, it has no patriotism to any particular location, and it's all about money. turn nature and human creativity into money. Fish swimming has no value alive. It's only when you kill it. A tree standing has no value standing. It's only when you kill it. 1,000-year-old redwood tree, is it a gift of the creator to be preserved for future generations, to be in awe of? No, it's $300,000 worth of lumber on the lumber market. Kill it, take it down, turn it into furniture, whatever. That ideology will destroy the biological basis of human civilization. You see the floods in Spain, the floods in Korea, all this crazy weather going, climate chaos, not global warming, climate chaos. You won't find the insurance industry denying climate chaos. They understand it. The reinsurance agencies like Swiss Re, Munich Re, Lloyd's of London, they are now saying to their clients, the insurance companies, you got to show us your climate impact report because we're the ultimate backstop on paying out for all this environmental damage. This is crazy. We can't keep doing this. These tendencies are going to intensify. What is bad about the global economy is going to keep getting worse. And what's good about the grassroots movement of the green economy, locally controlled, nature-friendly, community-oriented, solidarity among the people, labor rights, fair trade. The fair trade movement is growing rapidly. Global Exchange was one of the founders of Fair Trade USA. I was involved in the early startup with Paul Wright, who's raising the money to get it started. That's now dealing with millions and millions of dollars of trade in coffee and tea and cocoa and bananas and honey and all sorts of products. One little vignette. We were down in Cuba. Global Exchange does what are called reality tours. If you go to globalexchange.org, you'll see our reality tours. We've taken more people to Cuba than any other organization. We've been taking people to Cuba for 30 years. We were down, I had a delegation of Americans in Western Cuba, Pinar del Rio province, and we're on a tobacco farm, family farm, and the farmer is explaining how tobacco grows. People say, what about pesticide? He said, oh, you don't need pesticide. He holds up a leaf. He tears out the stem in the middle of the leaf. He says, you tear these out. You're not going to use them anyway. You throw a bunch of them in a barrel of water. After a few days, you take that water and you spray it on the crop, kills the bugs, which tells you something about why you smoke cigarettes. But he's showing us how to roll cigars and a little bit of honey to seal it. It's very interesting. And somebody says, do you have any to sell? And he pulls out a satchel from underneath his bench, and he's got a pack of 10 cigars wrapped with a banana leaf around them, $20. That's $2 per Cuban cigar. If you could get a Cuban cigar in the U.S., Jay Leno and Schwarzenegger, they get them. It'd be like $70, $80 per cigar. So we're getting this great deal, $2 Cuban cigars. This guy in 10 minutes made 2 years of income, 2 years of average income. So you see the potential of fair trade. The global inequality, if we bring first world consumers into more direct contact with third world producers. I used to go, Global Exchange had 5 fair trade stores, and I would go out on buying expeditions. And I'm in Namibia, and there's a woman out on the street corner selling wooden salad spoons and forks that are hand carved, beautiful. And I ask her how much. And I do a calculation in my head of how much we can sell them for. And I give her more, about twice as much as she was asking. And she says, oh, you don't understand the exchange rate. And I say, no, I understand the exchange rate, but we're a nonprofit organization. I'm giving you our profit. And then it's up to me to try and get back and sell it and pay our rent and all that kind of stuff. All 5 of our stores were put out of business by landlords who owned the buildings of the stores, jacking up the rents so that our profit margin evaporated. So that's the choice that people have. You want to do cutthroat capitalism, or you want to do something that's fair. that brings things together. And I've seen personally places where children are out in coffee plantations, 6-year-old kids, 7-year-old kids. And I relate because I had my first job when I was 6 selling newspapers on the street. But I made $3 a week. I had folded money at 6 years old. It was awesome. But you see these kids out working in a coffee plantation. The kids don't have shoes on, and there's snakes and poisonous spiders and stuff. This is just wrong. These kids need shoes. Fair trade provides a floor price for the product. If the world market price goes above that, the fair trade price goes up. If the world market price goes down, that floor price stays there so that the planters, the workers, the farmers, they can actually plan ahead and know what they were going to get paid for their crop planting time. Because when you're planting and 6 months later, you're going to harvest, you don't know what the market's going to do. And the Chicago commodity traders and all this crazy stuff, the fair trade movement insulates the producer from that fluctuation in the world market. So that's why we're totally opposed to the world trade and to this corporate dominated world economy, because it's just about money. I always point out to my Christian friends, Jesus only got violent one time, and it was bankers. The money changers in the temple, and he whipped them with a knotted rope and threw their stuff on the ground. We don't want to whip the World Bank and the IMF and throw their stuff on the ground. We just want to change their headquarters into a nursery school or a place to train nursery school teachers or farmers or something useful. And we're going to do it with nonviolent direct action. It's proven its value over the years.
I had one last question. We're running short on time, and I don't know if Bob has another one after that. But a theme that's come up in some of these WTO 25 episodes we've been doing is about how NAFTA derailed American politics. It was very much a thing of the left in the late 90s, early 2000s around Seattle. But it's also something that Trump got elected on in 2016. And the sort of free trade agreements and things like that are something that he actually runs on, and he still runs on. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on about how NAFTA has really had this impact on American politics.
Yeah, it's interesting the way in which his derangement, and he's a dumb guy. My father-in-law actually knew the Trump family, and he knew Donald, and he said he was a dope. He was dumb, but he did trip across.
That's also a theme on our show too. So
he did trip across the fact that the white working class males got screwed by the factories of NAFTA and all this kind of stuff. Notice how the peasants of southern Mexico, when NAFTA came into force, they rose up, the Zapatistas. And my wife, Medea Benjamin, my wife at the time, she went down there to interview Marcos. And she's fluent in Spanish. She was a translator when she lived in Cuba, translating. And she goes down there and she says, I want to meet Marcos. And of course, his people are like, no, you're not going to meet Marcos. But she persists and persists. And finally, Marcos comes out and does an interview, and it got published in some magazines and stuff. And she said he was absolutely brilliant. And he was highly educated, urban intellectual who chose to side with the peasants. So if you think about, and you guys are part of this, I'm part of this, you have people who are lucky enough to get an advanced education, siding with the people like my father, third grade education, Irish peasant, who we combine the morality of those oppressed people who are suffering from the structure of the global economy with those of us who have the intellectual skills, the organizing skills, the fundraising skills to say, hey, if we combine forces, we can change the rules of the game. We can change this system. And that's one of the things that we always focused on our work is you have to have a structural analysis. In sociology, we divide between instrumental analysis. Oh, Bush is a bad guy. Trump's a bad guy. And structural analysis. What are the rules of the game? What's the DNA of capitalism? I always tell people the DNA of capitalism is destroy nature and turn it into money. And it gives people a different way of looking at the system. Until we change the nature of the game, I taught my daughters to play Monopoly. All you do is buy everything you land on. Pretty soon other people are paying you rent and you wipe them out and you end up with everything and they end up with nothing. But we would change the rules. The game is over when everybody's got roughly the same amount of wealth.
That game was created by a socialist too. So
Exactly, yeah. It was against rent, bad landlords, the woman who created it. She was
Right.
Well, to follow up on that, I grew up right next to Youngstown, Ohio, and I spent much of my time there now. And in 2016, the people there, they've been Democratic their whole life, Italy Union area. They hated Hillary Clinton. There's no way in hell they were ever going to go for her. And they equally liked Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who they saw as the same, which had its own issues. And growing up, my dad, when you talk about your father, reminded me of my dad, Italian Union president and so forth, taught me a lot of the same things you'd mentioned. I remember growing up, he would take me to these labor breakfasts that, the entire county, the senators, everybody, Glenn and Metzenbaum, I met them as a kid, the governor, everybody was a Democrat. Now I call it Texas North. NAFTA is a huge component of that, right? And have you tried to talk to, I don't know, Democrats, liberals, politicians, whatever, to try to explain this to them? Because I think there's still a denial about it, how much venom is directed, especially at the Clintons, among working class whites.
We saw how immigration is a big issue. So I use that as an entry point with people. And I say, look, U.S. heavily subsidized corn with billions of dollars of federal government money supporting U.S. corn growers. That corn is entering the Mexican market at a price below what Mexican peasants can bring it to market. You're wiping out the livelihood of Mexican peasants. Where do they go? They go to the border to come to the U.S. And that's why, to Biden's credit, he said to Harris when she was vice president, go down to Central America and figure out what's driving these people to the border. And it's that economy. My wife and I worked a lot in Central America. We had a woman in Guatemala explain how the government military came to their thatched hut one night, dragged her husband out, hacked him to death with machetes because, I said, why? He was teaching other peasants how to raise rabbits. And I said, why? She said, if we could feed ourselves, we wouldn't be forced to go down and sell our labor on the plantations that are owned by your companies, pointing at us. And you realize it's the structure of the system that's the enemy. It's not particular individuals. We don't want to hang anybody. It's the structure of the system.
Well, I want to hang people.
Until you change the rules of the, you're not going to fix the cause of the problem. You got to get at the roots of the problem. The word radical comes from the word for roots. Makes sense.
After NAFTA, something like 200,000 tomato growers in Mexico were driven off the land.
Wow.
And that's, like you said, corn. It's occurring in all these industries. And that never becomes, immigration becomes this like moral issue. Here in Texas, it was just hysterical stuff. They're all going to come here and commit crimes and rape you and kill you and take your jobs and so forth. And I've never heard anybody try to describe it like you just did as a labor issue, as an issue of displacement, as primarily an economic function, right? Whereas here in Texas, especially, it's like more of these bad people want to come up here, make life bad for you. It's just this simplistic thing. And you would think who would fall for that? But pretty much everybody does.
Yeah, it's the kind of desperation that if you saw that immigrant person on the street corner suffering, moral authority would say to your heart, help them.
Yeah.
Help them. The Good Samaritan. Come on. Let's bring out the best in the American people, not the worst. So
I think we're at the end of our time, unless Bob has anything else.
No, are you working on a new book or anything now? You want to say anything about what you're doing now, or?
I'm actually working on creating a community in my forest, in my 18-acre forest. I'm going to recruit young couples with children because children in a forest is a great place to grow up. I'm lucky in that my 18 acres is remote because it's a steep hill, but it's near town. So it's got the best of both worlds. Quincy, the town I'm in, has great live music every week and good restaurants, but very few people. There's one traffic light. So I'm dealing with that urban stuff. And I'm working on some writing projects, too many scattered around. I'm working on a trivia game that would be called Significant. And it would be questions that are important, right? What percentage fat is the human brain? 60%, because the myelin sheath that covers the wires as insulation is fat. Things like that. And some other stuff that I won't bore you with, but keeping busy intellectually and chopping wood and digging into the hillside, making caves with roof over them, as you see in the background and stuff like that.
You look great. You haven't aged. It's a testament to good living. Kevin, I met you 25 years ago, and you had a huge impact then, and you continue to. And I'm really glad we got a chance to chat again about this, because I met you under these circumstances. And I remember telling people that day, it's like, hey, son of a bitch pulled it off. So, we'll have to chat again sometime. And the next time I'm up visiting Scott, we'll run up and see you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, folks, we've been talking with Kevin Danaher. I dug out one of your books, Insurrection, that you wrote with Jason Mark. Been talking with Kevin Danaher, activist and educator. If you like what you hear, and please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And we'll talk to you all again soon. Everybody should go out and misbehave and make a lot of trouble.